Story 1. I worked for a company that tested soil samples for mining companies. Each test required measuring 0.002 grams of a white substance, the name of which I can't remember. The company won a significant contract, leading to an overwhelming amount of work. To expedite the process, the manager instructed everyone to measure 0.02 grams instead of 0.002 grams. The results were incorrect, causing the mining company to waste $300 million searching for copper that wasn't there, resulting in a lawsuit against us. 300 people lost their jobs, which accounted for 50% of the company's workforce. The manager responsible for the poor decision did not lose his job. He denied instructing the gram change despite about 30 witnesses confirming he did. I started working at this company 2 years after the incident. I had never heard such criticism and disdain directed toward a person as I did for this manager. No one in the company respected him, and he was treated with absolute contempt. Some labs had signs banning him from entry, and employees frequently told him to leave when passing by. I tried to remain neutral, but hearing about the situation was difficult. Story 2. My boss at Walgreens. When she took the position from the prior shift, she promptly canceled the overnight shift, which was a problem because that was when we handled cleaning and restocking. She then shifted those responsibilities onto the evening shift but didn't increase their staffing numbers. Instead, she dismissed people on that shift for using vacation time. Even though the store had a 3-employee minimum, we often had 2, occasionally dipping down to 1 if the other person couldn't make it in, like being sick. Even if both people were present, it wasn't a small store, and they were expected to clean and restock while dealing with a large number of customers that only tapered off around 9 or 10 p.m. Since the store closed at 11 p.m., that left about 1 hour when everything had to get done, and there were still customers, just not as many. She routinely ignored vacation time requests, even if they had been filed months in advance, threatened people with termination if they didn't come in while sick, and harassed any employee who wasn't working at full capacity. So, if you took a moment to sit down because you had been on your feet for 8 hours, or if you weren't facing the store despite seeing a customer coming up to check out, she would get furious. It was nearly impossible to avoid write-ups, her reprimanding you, ignoring requests, and more, at least if you weren't on her shift. Oddly, not only was her shift always properly staffed, but every employee on it received a favorable review, complimenting their hard work even if they were entirely inept. My boss's supervisor worked at another Walgreens nearby, and I got sent over to help with the Halloween rush. He was utterly baffled that the so-called lazy and inept employee had completely restocked the entire store and cleaned it 2 hours before the shift was scheduled to be done, leaving no work to be done. Even when I explained to him what was going on, he didn't believe me. When I finally moved away and had to quit, she asked how much time I needed off and said she could give me 2 weeks at most. I laughed and informed her I was giving her a 2 weeks notice. My sole regret is that now, for years later, I had to move again, and the only large employer in the area is a different Walgreens, and I'm too scared to apply because they probably have me on file saying I did a lot of horrible things. Story 3. I work in a hospital. She frequently touches patients with unclean gloves. She once released gas in a patient's room so unpleasantly that the patient asked her to leave and not return. Aside from that incident, she has been dismissed from numerous patients' rooms for various reasons. She does not manage her time well and fails to complete her assigned patient baths. Most recently, she was caught touching a patient with a known communicable disease without gloves, and she interacted with an unclean specimen collection pan from the same patient, again without gloves. I initially felt bad for her because it seemed like everyone bullied her mercilessly, but she somewhat deserves it at this point. Story 4. I work in a cash industry with someone who refuses to lock her cash drawers. When I pointed out that she is on camera and could be fired for stepping away from her cash drawers without locking them, she said, "Well then, I'll just pretend. It is clear from the camera that the drawer is obviously unlocked." She keeps offering to search the building with her weapon, which she is absolutely not allowed to have on the premises, every time there is a security issue because she wants to shoot someone. Needless to say, we tell her no. She once credited the wrong account because the account number on the payment did not match any numbers we had. The person had transposed some digits. Instead of looking up the customer or contacting any of her colleagues, She punched in random numbers until something appeared and credited that account. She then blamed the people whose account she credited, who had nothing to do with the payment and were honest enough to inform us of the mistake. She once asked me if an email was domestic or international, and if it was international, what she would need to do to send it. She is genuinely surprised that no one else agrees with her prejudiced views. She makes constant loud personal phone calls about private matters that no one needs to hear, especially since we are not allowed to have our phones out while working due to security and privacy issues. She drinks exclusively energy drinks and cannot understand why she has severe stomach issues. She frequently goes to her car to grab something every 15 to 20 minutes, as if we cannot see through the large glass window to the parking lot that she is a regular smoker and the reason our nice flower garden is full of cigarette butts. She will talk to people as if they are in the middle of a conversation with her, even though they have just arrived or are walking by, and will continue that conversation for 5 to 10 minutes after the person is left. Story 5. I worked in corporate America for a Fortune 500 company. I have many stories to tell, but one stands out to me. The corporate headquarters, located in an $80 million building, has a master electrician who has been there for 40 years and knows where all the bodies are buried. I installed a number of uninterruptible power supply dual backup offline battery systems in 40 server closets at about $5,000 each. The units required a 30-amp breaker and receptacle with the correct gauge wiring. The master electrician changed my specifications without saying a word, calling for 20-amp breakers since that is what was already available. After my installation was complete, he went back in, cut off the 30-amp cable ends from the UPS units, and installed 20-amp connections. Now the UPS systems would not provide maximum runtime under load, and he had voided the warranty on $200,000 worth of equipment. He spent a month arguing with higher-ups that his opinion superseded physics, and I finally got the manufacturer to send a letter stating, "You bought it, you name it." I eventually had to remove all 40 units, replace the correct cable ends, and obtain confirmation from the manufacturer that they would still honor their 5-year warranties. Problem solved. 3 months later, the same site had a $400,000 end loader go missing. It disappeared and later appeared at the master electrician's farm parked in the back 40. He explained that he took it home to do some maintenance, despite having no heavy machinery experience, and stayed silent while everyone else was frantically searching for the end loader. No one fired him. 2 months later, he was arrested for his 3rd DUI. The executive team intervened with the courts and law enforcement, and he received probation. He kept his job for another year and then retired with full benefits and a substantial pension. Story 6. When I worked in the nursing home laundry room, my coworker refused to do the job she was hired for. She told the supervisor she wasn't going to do it and did not perform any other tasks either. She spent more time on the porch than in the laundry room and drove her friends home while she was on the clock. She refused to collect the soiled laundry more than once or twice per shift, even though she was supposed to pick it up 4 or 5 times. People would mention that they didn't see her for hours and often questioned whether she was actually present. She once called the supervisor to say she wouldn't come to work that day because she was too drunk. She was also working in the kitchen and would leave the laundry room for the kitchen because it paid more. Even after being told multiple times to change into clean scrubs before going to the kitchen, she continued wearing the same scrubs from the laundry room while preparing food. This woman received the same evaluation score and raise that I did, even though I was doing 99% of the work. Story 7. I work for a hospital. A few years ago, I transferred out of scheduling and into a different area of the hospital, specifically radiology. Before I left, they provided me with a new hire to train as my replacement. My specific role in scheduling involved transcribing paper orders from doctors' offices outside our hospital system into our electronic medical record software and into the patient's chart. I would then call the patients to set up their appointments for outpatient testing, such as imaging and cardiology. This job required more medical knowledge than some other scheduling positions, as the orders needed to be accurately entered into the patient's chart directly by the ordering doctor. Often, the way outside doctors ordered tests didn't match the terminology used in our computer system, so I had to interpret the requests based on my understanding of medical terminology. They assigned me this new hire because they believed she had medical experience. I was informed she had been an office manager for a doctor's office. It turned out she had actually worked in a dental office, which is a significant difference, as hospitals do not deal with dental issues. She had no knowledge of human anatomy beyond the mouth and could barely name organs, let alone know their locations or functions. Besides that, she demonstrated a lack of competence. She claimed to have been let go from her managerial position due to downsizing during the COVID-19 pandemic. I suspect she was just as ineffective in that role, and they used COVID as an excuse to terminate her employment. After only a couple of days, I approached my scheduling supervisor and requested someone else to train, explaining that this new hire could not perform the job. My supervisor insisted that she had medical experience, prompting me to clarify that it was only in a dental office, which elicited a reaction of frustration. However, there were no other candidates available for the job, so we were left with her. Still, I had a few weeks to train her, and I did my best. I provided her with lists and resources, wrote out medical abbreviations, and repeatedly explained that when a doctor orders a RUQ ultrasound, it refers to the right upper quadrant of the abdomen. In our specific software, we needed to enter it as a limited ultrasound of the abdomen and specify in the free text area that it was an RUQ. Yet, every time she encountered this abbreviation, she would stop and ask me its meaning. She had stored all my notes and resources in a binder but never referenced them, opting instead to ask me. I did my best and then moved on to my new job. In my new position in radiology, many of our patients ended up being scheduled by her, so I still had to deal with her mistakes. She would schedule the wrong tests, provide patients with incorrect instructions, and never seemed to face consequences for her actions. When we identified her errors, we would call her, and she would apologize profusely, claiming she didn't know and would not make the same mistake again. However, I knew she understood better because I had taught her those things. Fast forward 3 years, and she still hasn't learned. She continues to make errors with patient orders and appointments. Recently, she scheduled a patient for a regular computed tomography scan when the ordering doctor intended for a specific type of computed tomography scan that involves injecting contrast directly into the patient's spinal canal, rather than through an intravenous line. She realized her mistake at nearly the last minute and attempted to conceal it by changing the appointment to the correct test about an hour before the patient was due to arrive, without notifying anyone. Fortunately, our department noticed the test appeared on the schedule, prompting us all to react with disbelief, as these procedures require prior planning. When we prepare to perform procedures that involve inserting large needles into patient spines, we need advance notice to ensure that an interventional radiologist and a nurse are available, and to prepare the patient accordingly. Patients must be off blood thinners and must arrange for a driver. When we called her, her excuse was that she didn't realize it wasn't like a regular computed tomography scan. The term intrathecal was in the test name. While a layperson may not understand that word, anyone involved in planning patient care should make an effort to learn the necessary terminology. Story 8. Sleeping on the job occurs frequently. Employees often take naps within half an hour of arriving, continue with mid-morning naps until lunch, and nap again in the afternoon. Some even sleep through closing time, remaining in their cars for hours after everyone has left, with reports of vehicles still in the parking lot 2 to 3 hours after closing. There is false documentation indicating tasks were completed when they were not, due to employees sleeping. Additionally, important documentation of tasks that were completed is often missing, as employees forget about them during these naps. There are also unmet promises to customers because employees fall asleep shortly after conversations. Story 9. An older individual in his 60s has been heard screaming at coworkers multiple times and has been banned from entering 3 of the buildings where we work. He has been banned from one of the buildings 3 times. He screamed at and threatened a female coworker because she reminded him of his mother, despite her simply walking by. He even admitted to his remarks in the police report. He physically grabbed a female coworker and shoved her out of a room, with a witness overhearing the incident over the phone. He constantly accuses everything of being politically correct, often going on long-winded rants and conspiracy theories about how women exist solely to have children, regardless of whether other workers or the general public are present. He does not perform the job he is paid to do at all. However, it is considered acceptable because he has bipolar disorder. When I first started working in the federal government, I was told I would never be fired for anything short of murder. Like everyone else, I rolled my eyes, thinking it was just an exaggeration. I am now convinced that a federal employee will never be fired for anything short of murder. Story 10. Most recently, he was reprimanded by the department manager and human resources for yelling at a customer and smelling of alcohol. He was explicitly informed that he could not assist front counter customers. The only reason he has not been terminated yet is due to health issues. Story 11. A girl who worked at the bar where I was employed would often get drunk during her shifts. She would loudly yell at customers who refused to leave after the last call. There was an incident where she ripped her top off in the restaurant while intoxicated. She also randomly smashed glasses and laughed hysterically on the restaurant floor while customers were present. She had a relationship with a bartender but eventually cheated on him with a customer, leading to chaos. She did not get fired initially because the owners found her attractive. However, she was eventually let go for taking 3 customers to the office and accessing the backup liquor supply. Story 12. It has been a few years, but I worked at a warehouse, and a 19-year-old taught me how important it is to be liked, more than simply working hard. The lead and our supervisor would often leave early in the shift, get intoxicated, and return just to clock out. The only reason they didn't do that every day was that he would miss 2 to 3 days of work each week. I was the hard worker who picked up the slack, even for our supervisor. I voiced my complaints, but they never cared. They would sometimes get so intoxicated that our supervisor would call us, and we would drive out to bring them back to their homes. Eventually, the young man took a position in another area for an additional 50 cents and got fired after a week. The supervisor who had been drinking with him got promoted, and the lead who joined them received the supervisor position, even though I was more qualified. I learned my lesson and left. Story 13. He used to inhale dust cleaner and then fall asleep. It was an open layout office, and his desk was right next to the studio manager's. Story 14. He would constantly speak Vietnamese to people, then scream at them for not listening to him, despite knowing we couldn't understand him. He was also homophobic and racist. He only got fired for calling the regional manager an offensive term. Story 15. Working for one of the largest chicken producers in the Middle East, we have strict biosecurity protocols on chicken farms because the birds are fragile and close to each other, making infections spread rapidly. We use separate trucking fleets for each of the 16 farms, which is critical. During peak season, logistics were slow, demand was high, and buyers were complaining. The division head waived the biosecurity protocols, allowing any truck into any farm for the sake of speed and convenience, without proper decontamination at entry and exit. Bird flu hit the farms. By the time it was detected, after a 14-day incubation period, instead of being contained to one farm, it affected all 16 farms. Because they used a common fleet, the outbreak resulted in the loss of 100% of our chickens, around 2 million birds. The business lost $20 million in capital expenditure in just 2 weeks. The entire gene pool developed through selective breeding over a decade was lost. Suppliers moved to competitors, and we still haven't won them back after 4 years. Our market share plummeted to 0, and the insurance company determined that the business was at fault and did not pay out. The business head was transferred to the corporate office and now earns the same salary for significantly less work. How that happened, I'll never know. Story 16. She is currently on leave after being reprimanded due to my report. Her performance is subpar, and I have taken over some of her responsibilities during her absence. The problems I have discovered are astounding. Additionally, she is very difficult to work with. She works from home 3 days a week because her demeanor has led our manager to prefer that she not be in the office. Story 17. Frank. No one knew how Frank kept his job. Frank and I were both in technical support, fairly low level, but at least it was internal support rather than customer-facing. Frank took either Monday or Friday off every single week. He'd call in sick. Sometimes he'd take both. We didn't have anywhere near that much paid time off for sick days, but he never got in trouble for it. It's unclear if they were all paid days off or if he just received unpaid time off after a while, but we assumed they were paid since nothing was ever mentioned and he never stopped calling in sick. You'd think it was nepotism or favoritism keeping him employed, But we never saw any evidence of that, and honestly, he'd probably have a more comfortable job if that were the case. Baffling. Story 18. A male manager, age 44, committed adultery with his female subordinate, age 20, by exploiting his authority. The girl reported the incident to the compliance department, but it resulted in her being transferred to a less desirable branch while the manager faced no consequences. Story 19. I knew a guy who received 2 Article 15s, the Army's version of a disciplinary action, back-to-back for fighting. One incident involved a member of his platoon, and the other involved his platoon sergeant. He genuinely didn't care and was surprised when, finally a year after his ongoing misconduct, he was discharged. I was only there during the last few months of his service, but his attitude before and after learning about his discharge was virtually the same. Story 20. He was incompetent, and his work was embarrassing to be associated with. I believe he may have used manipulative tactics to maximize his efforts to gain favor. Story 21. In a previous job, the chief financial officer was the chief executive officer's brother, so he had an indefinite pass to avoid consequences. Here are a few highlights of his impact. He inserted himself into projects he wasn't a part of and penalized the team by shortening deadlines without justification. 2 examples of this destroyed the company. In Project 1, which I was involved in, we aimed to create a self-service kiosk for license plate renewals. The original deadline was set from September to August. The project manager assigned the necessary development personnel and collaborated with hardware experts. Work began and progress was smooth. Stand-up meetings reflected great advancements, hardware passed testing, everything was compatible, and the back end was progressing well. The front end needed some work, but the manufactured prototype was scheduled for completion by March 15th, allowing us to test the system. On March 15th, the prototype was not quite ready. It was expected to arrive on the 17th, which was not a problem since the deadline was in August. However, during the stand-up meeting on the 18th, the chief financial officer was present and exclaimed, "All right, why is the prototype just now being unloaded? This goes live on April 15th. Everyone, including the project manager, responded in unison, "What are you talking about? The contract states August." The chief financial officer replied, "Well, I just changed it." This resulted in a month of scrambling. The front end became a mess, and the back end faced catastrophic issues that could have caused the entire system to collapse. On April 10th, during the stand-up meeting, this was communicated, but the chief financial officer stated, "Not my problem, and we need to change several key components because we want the ability to use basic card swipes. Consequently, the hardware had to be modified, and the software needed adjustments to accommodate these changes." The situation by April 18th was a significant failure, directly attributed to the chief financial officer's decisions. At that point, 3 front-end developers resigned, as well as 5 back-end developers. A stable version of that system was not achieved until around August, but the chief financial officer pushed for a release in April, claiming he could get things done. However, he delivered a flawed product. In Project 2, which involved a complete rewrite of the main software, the deadline was initially set for 2.5 years. The chief financial officer once again forced the timeline to just 9 months. This project resulted in the loss of the entire back-end team 4 times, meaning new hires had to be recruited who then struggled to understand the project due to the turnover. Ultimately, this project was scrapped entirely, costing approximately $7 million without a valid reason. The company was eventually acquired, and the new owners made it a priority to terminate the chief financial officer. Story 22. Night shift worker has had multiple complaints filed against him for aggressive behavior and verbal abuse. Many people refuse to work the same shift as him. He frequently calls out at the last minute, leaving us scrambling to fill his shift. When he does show up, he often neglects his duties, leaving work unattended for over 12 hours. He also creates a significant mess, smearing substances on tools to force others to clean up in the morning. Additionally, he sends passive-aggressive emails and leaves unkind notes for coworkers. Despite this behavior, he continues to be employed here. Occasionally, I ask others what they would write in a card if he were to leave after being fired, And the general consensus is that no one would bother because they know we would not write anything in the card. Story 23. One person calls in 3 days a week and is difficult to everyone. She complicates matters unnecessarily and goes to our supervisor whenever someone makes a minor mistake. Somehow, she received bonuses just for doing her job, yet when I covered for her, it was the first time someone's room had been cleaned in months. She used to be treated with leniency by previous supervisors, and the only time she was reprimanded, she took the day off afterward. She has emotional issues that others are wary of triggering. Personally, I don't care and just roll my eyes. She does not perform any additional detailed work. Story 24. I worked for a large subsidiary that consistently generated profits for its parent company. The parent company decided their stock price was too low and mandated that our subsidiary lay off over 100 employees. The boss of our CEO flew in to personally oversee the cuts, along with the head of human resources. The goal was primarily to cut older, higher earners rather than focus on removing underperforming staff. I felt particularly bad for one employee in his mid-50s who was an exceptional worker and had a child in college. They also terminated the employee sitting next to him, a recent hire who was unproductive and spent excessive time on unrelated discussions. This individual broke down in tears in front of the corporate leaders, expressing how long it had taken him to get the job and his uncertainty about what he would do next. The corporate leader was moved and the individual retained his position. The layoffs significantly affected morale, but keeping that employee only worsened the situation. Story 25. An executive who regularly visited people's homes when he couldn't reach them by phone or email. He did this when employees were out sick, on vacation, on maternity leave, and even once on Christmas Day. He also made me call someone who was in a car on the way to her mother's funeral, and another time he went to a man's hospital room. He was unreasonable and human resources just ignored it. Story 26. They eventually fired him, but it took months. He would sleep in the shop with his feet propped up, arms folded over his chest, and chin down. Multiple pictures were taken. He stole from the pantry and housekeeping, and probably from the maintenance shop. He took the shuttle for joyrides, putting upwards of 40 miles on it at night. He even went into the pool shed to sleep. He adjusted his time to get more hours by never actually clocking in and instead using time adjustment forms to claim he was there 2 hours before he ever showed up. He walked around on his phone constantly and stood in the lobby watching football. I was so glad when they finally fired him. Story 27. I'm a bank teller, and I trained this girl about 3 years ago. She went through all the training modules 3 times and still did not understand our teller system. Our system is very basic. It literally has buttons for deposit, loan payment, and cash check or withdrawal. For the record, I've never had an issue with anyone else I've trained. There are some growing pains, obviously, but nothing like this. She had constant policy violations such as leaving cash around, having excessive amounts of cash in her drawer, depositing into the wrong accounts, even taking money out of the wrong account, and giving incorrect amounts of cash, despite us having a machine that dispenses cash for us. She's a mess. Recently, she received a promotion to a banker position, which is surprising on its own, but she also gained supervisor capabilities. With those capabilities, she can override transactions. If there's a discrepancy or a transaction needs to be reversed, she can override it, as well as override those who don't have supervisor access. She has already overridden herself 3 times. One instance involved her voiding a transaction after she had already given the customer a receipt. She claimed the date was stale because they wrote 23 instead of 24. So, she voided it and called the customer, a business customer, to say they needed to come collect the entire deposit, 13 checks plus cash, rather than just allowing the check to go through or simply depositing it without that particular check. The customer arrived days later, and both the customer and my coworker were tallying up the figures. The customer was receiving $1,000 while my coworker was counting $915. They deposited the checks and moved on. An hour later, the customer called, noting a discrepancy due to the cash in the original deposit. It turned out she hadn't removed the cash from her drawer initially. As a result, she was over $64 on the day of the original transaction. The next time she had her drawer inspected, She was over by $21, totaling $85. This means she should have been off on the day of the transaction, not just $64. None of us knew any of this because she can override herself. She either cannot count or split the difference across 2 different days. Neither of those options is good. She's also been leaving cash around again. Fun stuff. Story 28. She does nothing, including her job. Not only was she not fired, but she was also promoted, and the tasks of the job she was promoted to were delegated to 5 other staff members across 2 departments. Story 29. I had a low-level manager who constantly flirted with female subordinates, openly asking them out on dates, leaving no room for plausible deniability. It was well known, and he targeted a significant number of women. He was often assigned to train new hires because he was interested in them and generally came across as inappropriate. I think he got away with it because it was so widely known that many assumed he had already been reported, but nothing changed. Everyone I spoke to had the impression that reports had been made, which created a sort of bystander effect regarding the sexual harassment. Interestingly, a few others in management were fired for similar behaviors that were reported to human resources, so I don't believe the company condoned it. However, this individual was so blatant in his actions and had approached so many women that his misconduct never reached HR, as people assumed it already had. He may have eventually been fired, but he managed to evade consequences for at least the 2 years I worked with him. Story 30. Someone did something foolish that led to being hacked and lost 6 figures due to a misdirected payment. 6 months later, the same woman made the same mistake with a large 5-figure payment. After 6 months went by and the money could not be recovered, they decided it was time for her to leave. Story 31. They didn't get fired, but they no longer work there. They literally did no work and used company resources for personal use. Management refused to hold them accountable or give them deadlines for deliverables. Many people can operate with low productivity, but what sets this employee apart is that they infested our office with bedbugs. We started finding a bedbug crawling across a desk in the cubicles near theirs. Then we were finding them regularly in their cubicle and even crawling on them. It was several years of frustration until human resources took our complaints seriously. Fortunately, most of us who worked in the area did field work and just avoided being in the office as much as possible. I firmly believe anyone who says that bedbugs cause post-traumatic stress disorder. Story 32. Lifeguard here. She almost let 3 children drown due to incompetence, then blamed the other lifeguards who weren't supposed to be on duty. She also gets into arguments with everyone at every opportunity. Story 33. As a teacher, some colleagues simply cannot teach or may not know the content well. However, it is easier to manage this situation than to find a new person, I suppose. Story 34. He spends hours a day on his phone and admits this. He has repeatedly violated rules regarding sexual harassment and substance abuse, confessed to stealing from the company numerous times, damages equipment almost daily, and consumes alcohol on the job. Despite these behaviors, after 14 years, he still works at the company in Vermont. Story 35. A young employee asked our only female coworker if she had any spare clothes he could use to dress up his doll. He had previously had several team members request upper management to terminate his employment due to his poor performance and other issues. Even after the female coworker reported the incident, management did not take action. She eventually escalated the matter within the company, which led to his termination. The only explanation we could think of for his ongoing employment was that his mother was a middle manager. Story 36. He was a former felon for drug dealing and violent robbery. I am pretty sure he was a drug user and a racist as well. This is factory work with large presses. He spent most of his time claiming he was fixing his machine or that the parts weren't coming out right. Changeovers from one part to another should only take between 45 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on the dies. He'd regularly take 4 or more hours. Despite his output being significantly less than the rest of us, no action was ever taken to correct it. He got into numerous arguments with other employees, including calling one employee a racial slur. The employee was Hispanic, not black, so he just laughed it off. The employee handbook states that racially motivated attacks are supposed to result in immediate termination. One day, he followed me into the bathroom and started yelling at me. I didn't hear him at first as I still had my earplugs in. I was at the urinal when I heard someone talking. I turned to see him and realized he was talking to me. I took my earplugs out to hear him. At first, I thought he was commenting on a meeting we had just attended, but then I realized he was screaming at me, calling me derogatory names and saying I thought I was better than him. I was confused and said, "Dude, what the heck? Get out. I'm using the bathroom." He kept shouting at me, claiming I was disrespecting him and asking if I wanted to fight him. I yelled back, "Get away from me." I managed to finish and zip up, but he was still yelling, standing just 5 feet behind me. I am a skinny guy with no real muscle, and he was more muscular, so I felt scared he would get physical. Thankfully, he walked out after I told him to leave multiple times. This bathroom has 2 entrances, so I went out the one he didn't. I started back to my station only to find him standing there waiting for me. I yelled, "Get away from me." Our shift lead approached and he walked away. I told the shift lead what happened, and he immediately took me to find a supervisor and report it. The supervisor took my statement and said he would talk to the guy and to return to work for now. Later, the supervisor informed me that he spoke to the guy and that it was a he said, she said situation and we just needed to stay away from each other. There was no write-up, no disciplinary action, nothing. Just a slap on the wrist. It was frustrating. Time passed and I avoided the guy. He got into more situations with other employees. For some reason, they decided to train him to operate the forklift. The rule is that while in training, a certified operator must walk next to you whenever you are on the forklift. He started hopping on it by himself every chance he got to practice. One day, I came back from break and saw him with a fully loaded container, about 2,000 pounds, lifted about 20 feet in the air, doing circles in front of a press for no reason. For the next hour and a half, he was on the lift randomly moving things around, taking items on and off racks. He nearly dropped a 1,000-pound die trying to put it back on a rack. No one did anything about him. Eventually, he got certified and spent more time on the lift than at his station producing parts. A few months later, I got forklift certified as well and received a promotion to backup shift lead. Whenever I was in charge of the department, he would go out of his way to disobey me. I'd tell him to return to his station, and he would roll his eyes or make mocking remarks. I repeatedly reported his behavior to our supervisor and even his manager, but they couldn't get permission to fire him. It took over a year of complaints about him before the company finally stepped up and walked him out one night. I found out later that he got sent back to prison for more violent crimes. To this day, we still share stories about how problematic he was. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.